Good evening. I'd like to interrupt your slideshow at this time, and I want to call the Anacortes City Council meeting for November 21st, 2016 to order. Ms. Hunt, would you take the roll?
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mr. Walters? Ms. Pickett?
Here.
Mr. Adams?
Here.
Ms. Lovett?
Here.
Mr. Archibald?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Thank you. Would you all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? So the first thing on our agenda this evening is a Mayor's Award of Merit, and we have two city employees we'd like to recognize this evening. I'm going to read an introduction of letters I sent to both of them, and then I would ask both the Jeffs to come up and receive your award. So the first letter was to Jeff Beltramini, and it said, "Dear Jeff, congratulations, Jeff. You've been nominated to receive the Mayor's Award of Merit because of your outstanding and diligent performance in the engineering division. Your supervisors and co-workers commend your eagerness and steadfastness in handling each task that's before you. I appreciate your positive responsiveness when providing assistance, creating a pleasant atmosphere in the engineering division. You provided exceptional customer service, coordinating various sewer and water projects in our downtown area. Your tireless efforts to coordinate with business owners and keeping them informed of the schedule and addressing their concerns and accommodating their needs produced a successful outcome with very little impact to our businesses and residents of the community." Yes, when you're trying to tell a business owner that they won't be able to use their sewer system for 8 to 12 hours, that requires some considerable customer service skills. So we commend you, Ms. Jeff. Then we have another Jeff, Jeff Vogel. "Dear Jeff, congratulations. You've been nominated by the Children's Librarian to be able to receive the Mayor's Award of Merit because of your self-driven initiative, exceptional customer service," and that's Jeff right now in the middle of your screen, "outstanding performance at the Anacortes Public Library. Through your ingenuity, you have designed and built the library website that is fully functional and user-friendly. You also took on the large task of planning and assembling and submitting an RFP for the new integrated library system. You represent the city well, consistently providing outstanding customer service with a positive attitude. You're a strong team player and are often the first person to jump in and offer assistance. You serve as a role model for professionalism, dedication, courtesy, work ethic, customer service, and attention to detail. It's very impressive when you go above and beyond the call of duty for the library, the city, and our community." And I personally thank Jeff because I went and visited him on TechWise Tuesday, and he taught me how to use my Surface tablet. So at this time, I'd like Jeff Vogel and Jeff Beltramini to come forward, and I'm going to hand them their awards and show them the plaque. So I have another recognition this evening. It's the Outstanding Wastewater Treatment Plant Award from MPDE&S. And this is an award for special recognition award of 5 consecutive years of outstanding performance from 2011 to 2015 from the Washington State Department of Ecology. It recognizes exemplary effort and work accomplished by the City of Anacortes and the dedicated team at the Anacortes Wastewater Treatment Plant. Thank you for protecting and keeping Washington waters clean. And this is signed off by the Department of Ecology's and Washington's waters, ours to protect. So, who is here this evening? Is this Matt Reynolds here? Oh, Becky, come on forward. So come on up. The third item on our agenda, do we have a Lodging Tax Advisory Committee report this evening? Mr. Miller.
Not nearly as exciting as all that, but on Thursday, the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee met. It was my first meeting, and certainly appreciate the council appointing me chair to that. But also I'd like to thank Mr. Walters, Mr. Archibald, Mr. Adams, and the work that they did before I got on the council for building the strategic plan, because that strategic plan will be the guide for the LTAC, as well as viewing all the applicants through the lens of our comprehensive plan and that strategic plan to distribute the 4% money that the city collects from our hoteliers in town. I would like to say, though, again, I expect when we bring this to council, I don't know when, but we'll have another meeting to look at the applicants, and then of course it comes back to council. The chamber continues to be the largest requester, acting as the DMO for the city, and they gave a presentation at the Lodging Tax Committee, and again, they have great staff that continues their outreach to bring tourists and guests to our community. So I think that's all I have from that committee. Oh, and the one other thing, the RCW changed where it's going to require a little more fidelity reporting of the requester. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge when they ask for those funds to be able to report what tourist activities they're bringing into town. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Loveland.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a report. Councilman Johnson and I attended Community Actions Lunch and Learn last Thursday, and they had a fantastic panel to talk about permanent supportive housing, which is essentially a housing first model to get your most chronically homeless people into supported housing on the long term. They had a panel that included people from Skagit Regional Health. The Chief of Corrections, Charlie Wend, was there from Skagit County, and the numbers are in. We finally have data to go with it. It used to be that there was kind of this sense of providing homeless people with housing being the right thing to do, but now the numbers are in, and it lowers recidivism for people who are getting into jail because of mental health issues. It lowers, I mean, the numbers are dramatic. It's somewhere in the 70 to 80% in terms of the lowering of the stress on EMS, lowering of jail nights, lowering of hospital stays, all of those things that end up being incredibly expensive. And what it's pointing to is that it's tens of thousands of dollars per person annually less expensive to put them in permanent supportive housing. So the county commissioners just signed a resolution supporting that model in order to seek out funding and partnerships. And I was just speaking with Councilman Johnson earlier about perhaps Anacortes following suit with just a resolution in support of the county's efforts. It's not necessarily saying that we would have something here, because I think our needs are more in the workforce housing and kind of not quite the homelessness issue, although we certainly have that as well, and perhaps it would pave the way for opportunities to help those people additionally. They assume that in Skagit County the need for rooms is somewhere in the hundreds, whereas the need for affordable housing in the county is in the thousands of units. But it was really encouraging, because when you have people coming in from the health services and coming in from the Department of Corrections to paint this picture of these being nonviolent offenders who often get victimized in jail, and the benefit that there is to the community, the benefit to businesses, the benefit to everyone to have people in supported housing. So we'll be bringing that forward in years in the future.
Thank you. Any other council reports?
Just an aside to that comment, Mary Gare, there's a lot of favorable comments from the panel as well as others there on the efforts of Anacortes with the Affordable Housing and Community Services Committee Forum, that we're in the lead in Skagit County, and they're kind of looking to us to bring the results forward. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful.
Mayor Gare,
Mr. Adams.
it looked like there was a large participation in Harry Potter night at the library. And
Well,
hopefully,
that was a good lead-in.
oh, good. You are going to talk
I
about that.
am.
I was all excited and was going to ask if you could talk about that.
You just got to item D.
Oh, good.
On the so at this time, first of all, I want to thank the library staff, Sherry McClaskey, and especially Diana Farnsworth. She was the event chair. The library is another community space, and with this type of event, they provide a safe, fun atmosphere, a place where families can come together for an evening and have a little bit of magic and whimsy. And I think we had about 500 people attend. 600. 7. Well, so apparently they not only need it, want it, they embraced it. So if either one of you ladies would like to come up and talk about it for a moment at all, is there anything you want to add? And we could run the slides for a couple more minutes. And you need to all be commended. This was an amazing event.
We've got to run the slides for a couple more minutes, so
Okay.
I'm trying not to start from the very beginning.
And it was
because a lot of you have
last
seen
Thursday
a
night.
lot of these. Well, Diana definitely just came up with this fabulous idea, ran it by a few staff. Both Eric Berg and Kathy Berg were instrumental in giving her the excitement to move forward with this. And we just had so many staff come together. Doug Woods, Rhea Kilburn, Louise Vogel, all of the staff worked together as a team to pull this event together, and we had so many community partners. I know I can only remember a handful, so I'll give it a try, and then I'll let Diana chime in. But the best part of the night for me is, libraries are magical to me because I'm the library director, and they're just a magical place for me always. But this was a way for the community to truly see how magical libraries can be, and more outside the box, and just fun things to do at the library besides just books and DVDs, of course we have, but just just a fun space to be. And we had people all over the library in every single aspect of the library. We had the mayor as Professor McGonigal, Chief Bowers as Professor Trelawney, and the Anacortes American took over the photo booth, and Kimberly was taking a bunch of photos for us. I know we had the business and Watermark Books and Brewers and Pelican Bay. I don't know, I'll let Diana chime in now. It was just a really, really wonderful evening to see how, again, the staff came together, the community came together, the creativity was just phenomenal.
Well, it was definitely the community aspect that really brought the magic up. So some of the other partners that we had were the Boys and Girls Club. Taylor and a few other staff members came and ran Quidditch in the teen area. And we had many actors from Anacortes Community Theater, as well as many borrowed props and things, costumes. They helped us get everybody dressed. Class Act came and had some of their teen volunteers do face painting. Businesses contributed food, and it was just a really incredible thing to see all these different community members come together, and it made it very fun and reminded me of the things I remember from the library as a kid as well. So it was wonderful. Thanks for letting us do it.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to have to walk away from whimsy and whimsical, and we're going to go to item 4, which is public comment. And if anyone is here this evening to speak to the council about anything that is not on the agenda, it's your opportunity to come forward at this time. All right. So we'll move on to the consent agenda, items 5A through D. Council.
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Johnson.
I'd like to withdraw item 5D from the consent agenda.
All right.
Mayor Gear,
Mr.
make
Johnson.
a motion to approve item 5A through C on the consent agenda.
All right, so the motion.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve 5A through C. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item 5D, acceptance of easement for Smilk Inc. Mr. Johnson.
Mayor Gear, just interested in something that kind of appears in the 1940s in 2014. I just wonder if there's more to be said about that.
Yes, Mr. Buckemeyer.
Getting dizzy.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. That's not quite the image I wanted to have up there, but it's pretty close. Not a whole lot more than is what's in the council agenda bill. The Swinomish Tribal Nation has purchased the golf course, as everyone's familiar with, and during a routine boundary survey of that, they discovered some interesting information, and that is that Christensen Road was vacated in the past, 1940s era, and that's depicted by this gray line here. That's where it used to reside, and in 1940s it was vacated and reconstructed in its current location, shown there in the red. However, it was reconstructed without the benefit of a dedication of new right-of-way. So, in effect, there has been no existing public right-of-way there for that road alignment since that time. The bulk of this still lies in unincorporated Skagit County. However, there is that stretch that is within the city limits, adjoining the businesses there and the golf course itself. So the Swinomish are prepared to give us an easement for public right-of-way over the golf course half of that. And tonight's action really is authorizing the mayor to accept that easement. We're still working on the other side, the east side of it. It's considerably more complicated, as there's multiple property owners there with multiple frontages. And I should be also saying that Ms. Sweatman and I, and actually Steve DiGiulio, got involved in this early on. It's I've never ran across anything like it, and so it was interesting to work on.
Mayor Guerin.
Ms. Lovelet.
In dedicating this easement, is there any possibility that this could get turned into a private road that would then not have that connectivity?
Not a private road, no. There's a possibility that we would, once we get the other side of it cleared up, cleaned up, reconciled, that we would actually seek a dedication of public right-of-way and not just an easement.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
With that, I move that we authorize the mayor to accept the easement granted by Smilk Inc. As part of a council agenda bill 5D.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Johnson, second by Ms. Lovelet. Any other discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. So at this time, we'll be entering into public hearings. And we have, excuse me, is Corinne, did I see Corinne come up? Did you want to speak to the public comment piece?
Yes.
All right, so we'll go back to item 4. And this is, you're going to speak to us on anything that's not on the agenda this evening?
Well, I want to comment on the hearing examiner proposal. Is this the right time?
So it's not on the, is it, we're not discussing, yes.
I'm not sure.
So we're going to be doing that during the, it's 7A, item 7A.
Oh, okay.
So if you can come back at that point, that would be great. All right, so back to the public hearings. Item 6A, this is a closed record public hearing for the Musel 2-story building, first floor restroom serving the marina, second floor apartment, SSDP and land use CUP. And this is a discussion and a possible action item. Council.
Mayor,
Mr. Archibald.
I own property on Skyline Way just west of this development, so I'm going to recuse myself from the discussion tonight.
All right.
Mayor Gear,
Ms. Pickett.
I have known Harold Musel since we came to town in 1971, although I only run into him about once every year or two. If anybody thinks I should not sit on this, I will step down.
All right. Hearing no, it seems everyone's all right, so you may stay, Ms. Pickett. All right, Mr. Cricchio.
Mayor, council members, good evening. What's before you is a shoreline substantial development permit and a land use type of conditional use permit to permit a 22-foot by 30-foot 2-story building on the site. The first floor would contain a private restroom with showers, laundry facilities, and storage therein, serving the Bayside Marina, or Bayside Moorage, excuse me, a private marina. Whereas the second floor of the building would consist of a single-family residence or one-bedroom apartment serving the marina as a dockmaster. And Bayside Moorage is an existing private marina with 50 boat slips. The applicant is Mosel Investments, LLC of Anacortes, Washington, and they are represented by Schemmer Consulting of Anacortes, Washington. Project location is the eastern terminus of Skyline Way. An aerial showing the project location is the yellow right here. Underlying zoning district is commercial marine, and the existing land use is a marina and parking lot. The surrounding zone to the north, south, east, and west is commercial marine, and the adjacent land uses are to the north, a marina, to the south and east, a parking lot and condominium complex, and to the west, a parking lot. In addition to the zoning district, the subject proposal is located in a shoreline environment, and the underlying shoreline environment is urban. The applicant conducted a pre-application conference on January 26th of this year, and also a neighborhood meeting on April 11th of 2016. And then on August 12th of 2016, the applicant submitted the subject applications to the planning department for review. So an existing portable toilet is located on site today, and if approved, the porta potty would be removed. The application was deemed complete on August 29th. So the marina has a parking lot, and then the condominium complex also has a parking lot, and they are not shared. There's individual ownership for both. There's a mutual access and utilities easement that straddles the boundary line, providing ingress and egress to both uses. Skyline Way is a public right-of-way from Sunset Avenue south until approximately Cabana Lane. At that point, it turns into a private road. The project site or subject property is 2.92 acres cumulatively. However, the vast majority of that is over water. And so the applicant submitted a shoreline functional assessment prepared by Advanced Environmental Solutions, I believe, AES, and according to this report, approximately 23,344 square feet of the property is actually on the landward of the existing bulkhead. There was a 30-day comment period associated with the shoreline permit, and the comment period ended on October 7th. And then on October 26th, there was an open record public hearing before the Planning Commission. Noticing, noticing was done per Anacortes Municipal Code as well as state law. The subject property is posted in 2 different locations with public notice signage. It was posted at the library, City Hall, and the United States Postal Service. And in addition to that, it was posted on the city's website. And then both neighboring landowners and agencies and departments of jurisdiction were solicited for comment. Critical areas review. Although there may very well be critical areas waterward of the bulkhead, there were no critical areas determined to be on the property. And the urban shoreline environment has a 25-foot setback requirement for the ordinary high water mark, and they by far meet that with 39.4 feet. And then in addition to that, we like I said, we did solicit agencies and departments of jurisdiction, and we did receive comment back from the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation requesting an inadvertent discovery plan be prepared. That was forwarded to the applicant, and accordingly, one was prepared. And that can be seen in Exhibit 8 of your staff report. So in the urban shoreline environment, the proposed 2-story structure is outside of the 25-foot setback requirement. So it meets that requirement. And then both marinas and single-family residences are allowed in the urban shoreline environment. Ordinarily, the proposal before you would just go before the Planning Commission based on the project cost and the overall acreage of the project. But because there was a land use conditional use permit involved in this, they were consolidated, and therefore it goes before City Council. Consolidated concurrent review. Landscaping was addressed in the shoreline functional assessment prepared by AES, and 15% of the site is 3,501.6 square feet, but according to the shoreline functional assessment, they are 15.1%. And the conditional use permit, land use type of conditional use permit is being triggered because of the residence above the restroom that's proposed. So that's where the land use conditional use permit comes into play. And so, like I said, there was an open record public hearing on the 26th of August, following public testimony taken by the Planning Commission members. There was a motion made, and it was seconded, and following a vote, there was a 7-0 recommendation of approval to City Council. So, there was a site visit prior to the hearing today. And the project location is essentially on the other side of the tractor here. It's currently landscaped. The building would be within the landscape strip only. And you're looking at some pictures of the bulkhead that surround the project site and the marina. Currently, that is where people go to the restroom, the porta potty next to the dumpster. And here's a picture of a map of the site plan. The landscape strip is over in this location. This is where the building would be, if approved. 2-story. Some elevations of the proposed 2-story building. So this is essentially the bathroom on the first floor and the dockmaster residence or single 1-bedroom apartment above. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Grigio. And the council did have a site visit today at 4 p.m. So we were able to see defining features of that project. Other members of the audience that were part of the were parties of record that would like to address the council on this proposal this evening? And there were no appeals. Okay, council.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Just a couple of questions. The first one is, so this is before us because of the conditional use permit part, not the substantial shore development piece?
Yeah, so there's 2 parts to this project. One is the shoreline substantial development permit, and based on the project cost, which is approximately $50,000 and being less than 3 acres, ordinarily this would just be heard before the Planning Commission.
Yep, I got that piece. And then the conditional use permit part sounded like because it's a residence over a restroom, not just a residence, because a residence by itself would be allowed under the conditions in CM.
So in the CM, the residence itself triggers a conditional use permit.
Okay.
The restroom, however, we consider that accessory to the marina. Marinas are allowed both in the underlying zoning district as well as the shoreline environment.
Okay, got it. And I think the other question was, since some of the comments were, one of the comments, the opportunity to learn about the area before the road maintenance in there. And it's kind of a historic question because it's come up before with the ways, since this is before us, we're going to take a little time to try to learn about mistakes that may have been made in the past or not. When we approved those condos, I think in the 80s, there was an agreement, probably a condition that be maintained as a private road. Do you know the history on that one?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Meismer.
Thank you. There's quite a bit of history on that. There's absolutely no doubt. There were placed on those projects at the time some conditions that the various skyline divisions in the area worked together towards maintenance of that roadway, that private roadway. I think that over the past couple of months, the applicant has been working with a couple of the condo associations towards a maintenance agreement, from what I understand. And I understand they're very close to that.
And the reason I bring this up is because we've approved a number of these similar type projects where we say, okay, developer, you've got to maintain this. So I'm looking towards, if for some reason it's not maintained 20, 30 years down the road, what's our recourse, if any? It's just something to think about as we look at these projects. And I think and then the other question that came up, because I don't have it memorized, the liveaboard rules in the city limits of Anacortes. Are there any that would apply?
Councilman, I'm not aware of any liveaboard rules.
Thank you.
I'd also like, Mr. Meesemer, if you could, if the council took action this evening, what's the next step on this project? Could you explain that to us?
Thank you, Mayor. So the council this evening could have a motion that would direct staff to prepare findings of fact and bring those back to the city council for review and authorize the mayor to sign those. At this point, what we have is findings of fact from the Planning Commission in your packet.
I was talking about the shoreline piece.
Very well, thank you. So once the findings of fact are signed, then we would ship those off to Washington State Department of Ecology along with one of our transmittal letters. Then there's a 21-day appeal period with the Washington State Department of Ecology. Once that appeal period is over, the applicant can secure their building permit and begin construction.
So are there any other comments from parties of record? So if not, I'm going to close the public hearing on this, and the council, we can discuss it this evening. We could bring it back another night for action. It's your pleasure. Mr. Johnson.
Given the unanimous approval by the Planning Commission, I make a motion to approve the subject shoreline substantial development permit and land use type of conditional use permit subject to the staff suggested conditions of approval and condition approval number 11 added by the Planning Commission.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Johnson, second by Mr. Miller. Is there any other discussion? Ms. Hunt, would you take a vote?
Ms. Pickett?
Yes.
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Ms. Loveland?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Thank you. Item 6B. This is also a public hearing. This is on ordinance 2989, prohibiting medical marijuana cooperatives in all city zones. This is a discussion with a possible action this evening. Ms. Swetnam.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council, members of the audience. I'll keep my comments tonight brief because we did have a good discussion a couple weeks back about what the goal was with this ordinance, but the ordinance that's before you tonight in your packet would essentially ban medical marijuana cooperatives in all city zones. And as we discussed last time, medical marijuana cooperatives under new state legislation would allow up to 4 registered patients to grow up to 60 plants in one residence. And the concern is that there would be an impact on neighbors. If we ban the cooperatives, individual patients may still grow up to 15 plants, and if they're unable to do that themselves, then they can have an authorized agent grow on their behalf. They can also still purchase medical products at the retail locations in Anacortes. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions and open it up for public comment.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Lovely.
So when, speaking of medical patients that would have to authorize someone else to grow their plants, does that mean that that person has the right to grow up to 30 plants, or 15 is the cap regardless?
That individual could grow up to 30, 15 for the other individual and 15 for themselves.
I'm asking because I was approached by a gentleman this weekend who I think has kind of been auxiliary to the industry for many years, and he was just very concerned that there was going to be patients that weren't going to have the ability to grow plants. So I think there's just we're going to have to do a little more outreach, and I did my best to kind of educate him on the process of how we got to here, and that it's not a strict prohibition in that, you know, people can still individually grow plants for medicine if they would like, and that it was more that there just really wasn't any place to put them in town. I mean, are we able to entertain the idea that they could be on March's Point? I mean, I know we're pretty late in the game now to be throwing this wrench in the works, but I was kind of taken aback by his questions and realizing that there's still some kind of misinformation out in the community in general.
Certainly that is a policy decision that council can make. If there are certain zones where you would like to allow cooperatives, that can happen. You know, I think the concern and part of the reason why staff was recommending that we prohibit them at this point is, one, the state's still undergoing a lot of rulemaking, so we're not entirely sure what this is going to look like ultimately. Two, we've kind of come to the end of the life of our moratorium, and so rather than continuing to extend moratoria, you know, without some permanent rules in place, you know, that kind of puts the city in an awkward position. And three, I think it's a lot more difficult to dial something back that's been allowed than it is to kind of push pause, wait for that rulemaking to happen, and then maybe revisit the issue in the future. It could always be allowed in the future. I think it would be very difficult to prohibit those cooperatives once we'd already allowed them to happen.
Right, and I guess where I was going with this is just that I tried to explain to him that you just couldn't have 60 plants anymore. You know, we were trying to prohibit the amount that were in private residencies, and that, you know, if this became a problem for patients in the future, certainly we could look at it again, but that we weren't getting any feedback from those groups. And yeah, I think that this is a particular part of our constituency that has a really hard time finding their voice, and so, you know, he was kind of coming to me a little late in the game, and so I just wanted to bring that forward because I did just have this conversation.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Archibald.
So I've talked to quite a few people about this myself, and I think the biggest concern for patients is patients that aren't able to grow their own medicine, and for finding someone that can do that for them. Sometimes there's multiple patients that might need that. And I think the problem we had in the past with the co-ops is there's a lot of cannabis being grown and brought into the co-ops and being reshared with a lot of different patients. So my concern a little bit is having those 2 or 3 different patients that might need one person to grow a farm. It's not real easy to grow marijuana. It takes quite a bit of talent to be successful at it. So I don't know a little concerned about the impact. I don't know if there, it sounds like what you can do is you can grow for yourself and maybe one more patient, but not more than that. So that's going to be a little bit tight on some of those patients that just can't do it. I know some of those patients, they come into my store, so I'm a little concerned about that. But I understand the reasoning for not getting rid of the large kind of co-ops that were kind of flying under the radar. So I'm kind of stuck in between, but I understand why we're moving forward.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
My understanding is the main direct impact is 60 plants versus maximum of 30 plants. That's the real, and we talked about this at our last time we talked about this at council. It's, you know, concerned about nuisance of we're not restricting anybody's access. Like you said, you can get a medical card to be able to go to 2 of our retail locations, plus you still have the ability 15 per patient. So I don't think we're restricting anything there, and I suggest we move forward with this one.
Thank you. Mr. Adams.
So, Ms. Wetnam, you did reach out to stakeholders, and there was meetings. Maybe we didn't tie in everybody, but I think there was an attempt to get out and reach out to everyone that would want to be informed of this.
Correct, yeah. It was May 10th that we had a stakeholder meeting, and staff actually put a lot of energy into preparing that meeting and getting information out about it. We asked a representative of the State Department of Health and the State Liquor and Cannabis to come up, and they were both actively involved in the rulemaking process on the state level, so they were an amazing resource. We did have representatives from the hospital. I believe there were I mean, less than a handful of patients with concerns about this. So that was actually surprising. I was expecting that there would be, some of the concerns that we've talked about, but really, there wasn't a lot of pushback at that meeting.
Okay, so we have had some meetings. We've talked about this quite a bit. I agree that the state keeps changing the laws. They're still trying to figure out, still trying to dial it in, but it has changed a lot for the last couple of years. I mean, you can buy medical marijuana now at the retail shops, and you can still grow your own. So I think this is a happy medium. I think this works.
So is there any member of the audience that would like to address the council on this issue? Okay. Ms. Pickett. I was going to wait and see. All right. So I'm going to close the hearing unless someone else wants to speak to us about this. All right. This time the public hearing is closed on medical marijuana. And Ms. Pickett.
I move we approve ordinance number 2989 as proposed.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Pickett, a second by Mr. Johnson to approve ordinance 2989 prohibiting medical marijuana cooperatives in all city zones. Ms. Hunt, would you take a vote?
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Ms. Lovely?
No.
Mr. Archibald?
No.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. Pickett?
Yes.
Motion carries 4-2.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Whitman. So we have item 6C. This is also a public hearing on ordinance 2995, adopting a fund balance policy, repealing ordinance 2339. This is a discussion with a possible action this evening. Mr. Steffens and Mr. Hoagland.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council, members of the audience. Here to talk again about the fund balance policy. A little bit of background. Council Finance Committee and the Finance Department worked together to create this policy, and we discussed this last week at our council meeting. And with a few revisions, I believe the draft policy is ready for adoption. Some of the changes, so based on our discussion last week, I clarified the definition of GAAP as generally accepted accounting principles and added the fund names under definitions of governmental funds. Just the fund numbers were listed, now the names are there as well. Some of the clarifications, these are some of the things that we discussed that came up. I thought I'd recap them. We talked about the 20% of governmental fund expenditures, the individual funds, the 10% unreserved policy, the bond rating, some fund balance terms, and the current emergency reserve policy, the fact that's being repealed, and I'll go into detail on these items here in a minute. The 20% of governmental fund expenditures, this is the Economic Stabilization Reserve, or the Rainy Day Fund. That 20% of governmental fund expenditures, so those are the bolded funds that are defined in the policy as our governmental funds, and that's looking at this table. We have the fund numbers, we have the 2017 expenditure budget, the proposed budget at this point. So we would say 20% of that, for all of those added up, would be 4.5 million, and that amount is where we would set that amount aside in the general fund. And what that does is we're using these different expenditures in the individual funds to come up with a total that we're going to set aside in the general fund as an economic stabilization reserve. What this does is it in turn is basically 33% of the general fund budget. And we discussed last week the GAAP recommended minimum is 16.9% or 16.7%, 2 months worth. And we essentially have 4 months worth if we're going to do it in this model. And that gives us a lot more flexibility with this economic stabilization reserve, because we have that large amount in the general fund, and the general fund can give that money to any of these funds that may need it. Just gives us more flexibility than keeping 20% in the individual funds. So that's that aspect. On top of that, in the policy, we also address this unreserved fund balance. We were saying is the city desires to keep a 10% unreserved fund balance. It's kind of like we'd like to have at least this much in our account for items that may come up, and also just for cash, float purposes. Those numbers are these here. So these are all the funds would apply. The funds that have zero here are funds that at this point we're projecting to have a low fund balance for zero. It's difficult to project at the end of the year, but these funds are also essentially kind of flow through funds. Like Fund 105 is the street construction fund, and we fund that with REIT money or other money that would then fund a project that's being constructed, and it's usually funded from a different fund, and that is spent that year. That's why at the end of the year it would have a zero. The bond rating effect. So I looked into this and I found that basically a government that's following the GFOA and the GASB, which is Governmental Fund or Governmental Finance Officers Association and the General Accepted Governmental Accounting Standards Board, those two guidelines, if we're following those, then we would avoid negative impact on our bond rating. So we're above this minimum 16.7% that was recommended. We're far above that. That would look favorably to any bond rating agency. Clarification on the fund balance terms. These are defined in here, but I thought this was a fun way to put it. So. And this will be in the packet. Marcia Hunt will update this in the packet.
Okay.
The emergency reserve policy, to clarify, this will be repealed if we pass this ordinance. And what this would do is all that money that currently sits in emergency reserve cash accounts in each individual fund would then be shifted into the unreserved fund balance. It's merely an account title change within our system. And with that, do we have any further discussion or questions?
Mr. Johnson.
Last time we talked about the unreserved fund balance, wasn't that called the unassigned fund balance? Or am I thinking two different things?
Within the policy, I believe it's called unreserved.
Look at like page 3, maybe, of the policy, or the.
Is this unassigned?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Then yeah, that's unassigned fund balance. That's
okay,
correct.
Good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mayor Garrett.
Mr. Adams.
We've never had a policy like this, so I do appreciate the work of the Finance Committee and staff to put this together. I think down the road we're going to keep an eye on this, I think, and leave it open. I mean, I know this is a guide for us to use, but the budget is still fluid and flexible. So even though we have this, so is our intention to keep this really strict to this policy, or do we still have room to be flexible depending on what we need to do year to year with the budget?
Yeah, so the way the policy is written is this is a guide for us. You'll see we've used words like desire in this rate stabilization. How do we define it here? Established, defined to be used. It's vague there as well. I don't think there's any musts.
Okay, so it gives us some structure, but it still opens us up for some flexibility. So that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah. So I would say these reserve funds. This was the strongest worded section.
Mandatory.
And these are the funds that are for our computers and our equipment where we've decided to, when we purchase equipment, we are going to fund it over time to be able to replace it.
And Mayor here.
Mr. Johnson.
And once funds do go in the replacement reserve fund, they're almost fenced and hard to get to because it takes a major process and legislation to get them out. But that's why we'd like it.
That's correct. Yeah.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Loveland.
Phil, would you scroll down just a little bit more? There's the section that talks about paying back at a third of the, let's see, must be replenished within 3 years at the rate of at least 1/3 of the outstanding balance per year. What is making us do that? I mean, I mean, we don't have, obviously we can't like enforce ourselves per se, but I just want to make sure that if we're putting language into that policy, that it's a guideline, because it's phrased as a must. I mean, what happens if we don't have enough money to replenish those funds?
Then we would not be able to meet this, I would say. So up in when we talk about the Economic Stabilization Reserve, that this is something that, yeah, I don't even see in here that it must be established at this level, but we're saying that we're going to replace it. If we spend this money on something, we're going to replace it. And the 1/3 part is intended that it isn't just said, let's do it next year, and then 3 years down the road, we still haven't filled back up our reserve. Yeah.
Sure, I guess I'm just getting at what if we find ourselves in the financial position to not be able to replace it? And this might be a question for Mr. Hoagland.
Well, it's a committed fund, and so it takes legislative action by this committee to say you're not going to do it. So it's just saying it takes legislation to commit this fund, and it takes legislation to get out of this fund. So it would just take an action by ourselves.
Mayor, could
Mr. Archibald.
So I think when we were talking about this, biggest thing is we wanted to say that if we're going to go spend money on this fund, we want to be able to put it back in. I think the situation you're talking about, if we had to go and spend 100% of it because there's a natural disaster, I think the pay it back in 3 years is going to be thrown out the window at that point. I think we have more things to deal with than trying to figure out how to pay it back in 3 years. I think the idea was to replenish it. That's what that wording was for.
And that's really what came to my mind when you asked that question. If we're looking at a new world, we have a number of funds identified: the Parks Fund, Library, Cemetery. Some of those are just going to be gone, and 20% of zero is zero. So that number that we're going to have to lock up is going to be much less in a situation like that. And then, the city would be looking at a process of rebuilding itself.
Okay, I just want to make sure we weren't having our hands tied trying to pull money out of other places in order to, replenish this as a mandate with the word must. Not saying I don't want us to replenish the fund. That's not where I'm going with this. Just that's a very finite timeline for something that might be kind of a catastrophic event.
So at this time, is there any member of the audience who would like to weigh in on this? This is a public hearing. All right. No? All right, so I'm going to close the public hearing. And council, we can continue the discussion.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
I appreciate the answers on the percentages. I'm comfortable with those, and as well as the impact to the bond rating. So I think those are very important answers, and I'm comfortable with this policy.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
I move we adopt Ordinance 2995, repealing the emergency reserve policy and replacing it with this comprehensive fund balance policy.
I second that.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, a second by Mr. Archibald, to approve Ordinance 2995, adopting a fund balance policy and repealing Ordinance 2339. Ms. Hunt, would you take a vote?
Ms. Loveland?
Yes.
Mr. Archibald?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. Pickett?
Yes.
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
And Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
Again, I'd like to thank Mr. Steppen and Mr. Hoagland for the work they did in putting this all together. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you. Item 6D, this is also a public hearing. This is a continued public hearing on Ordinance 2993, adopting the 2017-2018 biennial budget. Mr. Hoagland.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, and members of the audience. After our discussion last week, one of the major points that we were going through was the increasing TBD fees in 2018 to supplement, not supplement, actually supplant the general fund funding for the $1.1 million pavement management program. So what the mayor and I worked on since then was
an alternative plan.
a pretty easy way to keep the $1.1 million in place, not increasing the TBD fees, and that would be through the use of real estate excise tax. Sorry, I wanted to bring up this is the chart, one of the charts that I use when I'm doing year-end forecasting. What I've got here is our current REIT balances for REIT 1 and REIT 2 are at 1.6, 1.7 million, respectively. Anticipating to bring in another 72,500 in each fund. So we'll looking to end the year roughly at 1.7, 1.8 million in REIT 1 and REIT 2. In 2016, we have 915,000 of REIT 1 projects and 602,000 of REIT 2 projects scheduled. So we're anticipating ending the year with combined REIT 1 and REIT 2 funding of just about $2 million. Looking at those cash balances and then what we have budgeted for capital projects next year, we've got 621,000 in REIT 1 projects, 800,000 in REIT 2 projects, plus what we're expecting to bring in revenues. We're anticipating on ending the year about 1.7 million in combined REIT 1 and REIT 2. And a similar picture the following year in 2018, anticipating ending the year at 1.6 million combined REIT 1 and REIT 2. Healthy balances, and we budget this way intentionally. We like to leave some reserves in REIT in the event the real estate market does start to tail off. What we have budgeted for the next several years through our biennial budget and capital facilities plan, we can still maintain a lot of those projects. But you can see with what we're anticipating, it would be easy for us to use an additional $300,000 in REIT to fully fund the Transportation Benefit District in 2018. I like this idea because it gives us 2 years to but to continue those discussions about how we want to fund the pavement management program. Mayor and I have talked quite a bit over the past week about that, and I think we do a good job of looking at positions as they come up, as people leave the city, at attrition opportunities. We're going to continue to look at that anytime we can to potentially save some tax funding that could then be reallocated into the pavement management program. And I'd like to have additional discussions about either increase in the TBD fee to $40, or perhaps following what Mount Vernon did and implementing a 1% or a 1/10 sales tax increase, but taking that to a vote of the citizens to see if they'd be willing to support something like that.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Well, again, I always find that we have those discussions backwards. We always talk about bringing in tax revenue first. The discussion that we need to have, that we talked about a year and a half ago or whenever it was, when we adopted our ordinance for the $1.1 million to manage our street maintenance, is after a couple years of doing this, let's see what we really need for our roads. That doesn't mean that I'm probably 90% sure we'll need more funds for the roads, but I just don't like talking about it backwards. Let's figure out what we need for the roads, and then yes, I agree that's a better way forward. Because as I've said before, we've hit everything. If you look at your city utility bill, pretty much we've hit up everybody for about $200 a year, and we didn't raise the storm. And we didn't raise the storm fee. That's the only one we didn't touch from 2015 to 2016. So break out your utility bill. So I just let's look at it the other way. Yes, we will probably have to go there, and that's probably the best way. And Mount Vernon went to the citizens, and the citizens said yes. But let's look to see what we need for our plan. We had a decent plan. Let's keep as long as we keep spending this 1.1 on our transportation, and then take a look, get our PCI or our PSI and indexing guys to come back and tell us we need to spend 60 million on roads, and then we'll have that problem again.
Thank
you. Miss Lovelet.
So I definitely would prefer a route like a voter-backed initiative over a councilmanic increase on car tabs. I think that allows the public to weigh in, and if they vote for it, we have a mandate to continue to add funds to that project because the public has officially prioritized it. If they don't vote it in, then we also have a different mandate to say that it's not enough of a priority for the citizens to be putting that much money in. So that gives the opportunity for it to be outside of this body and put it into the hands of the public, which I think is a really great way to find out how to do that. But I tend to agree with what Mr. Walters stated last week. If we were to go for a voter-backed initiative or an increase in the car tabs, that should be above the 1.1 million that we've already allocated, because we know that it's not enough. And that'll give us a chance for that evaluation that we talked about when we first formed the Transportation Benefit District, and it gives a more equitable allocation of money from lots of different people, visitors as well as community members, to help pay for the impacts on the roads.
Mr. Adams.
So this next couple of years, we do have a really healthy revenue sources coming into the city, so I'm glad you took this approach, found this money to use, and it does give us a couple years to think about and come up with a plan of permanent funding, so we don't have to keep figuring out where we're going to get the money each time we have a budget. So that's good. I just got my car tab bill, and it's way more than it's ever been. Like a couple years ago, it was under $50 for one car tab. Now it's over $80 2 years later, because the state's now figuring out they can start putting on extra fees, and it's all over. There's all these extra fees that weren't there 2 years ago. So we would have been, with that $20, we would have been putting it over $100 for a car tab. And so sometimes, without knowing the big picture, I'm glad we're going this route, and we're going to figure something out that's permanent.
Thank you, Mr. Adams.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
And we're also thinking too small, I think, by a large extent, because as was presented a couple of years ago, they said it would take $2.8 million per year for 10 years to get us to the point where out of our 100 miles of road, 109 miles to be exact, of roads in Anacortes, we would have 80 miles of roads in good shape, which we could maintain at $500,000 a year, in addition to the other roads we have yet to maintain yet. So we've got a long way to go, and we need to make some, and since next year is not a budget year officially, it may be a good time to think about really attacking this problem and getting serious about it. $1.1 million a year, from what we've heard thus far, will keep us well behind, and we'll never get all the roads we need paved and repaired.
Thank you. When Mr. Hogan and I spoke this week on this issue and realized that right now we're really healthy in the reserves, I felt confident for 17 and 18 we're in really good shape. But going into 19, like we just discussed, we don't know what the economy is going to do in the next couple of years. And so no matter what, we're delivering a balanced budget and able to do the roads for the next 2 years. I also, as part of the discussion, because one of the things that came up last week was about the reason we don't have money is because of staffing. So I asked, which I didn't totally buy, I asked Miss Hsu maybe to do just a quick little analysis for us tonight about the positions we have added over the last 3 years, and they were all, I believe, they needed to be added. So I'm going to let her address that at this time. So just to remind us of where we were in 14, where we are today, and then the other point being, as we do have attrition, if the economy does start to turn over the next 2 years, we'll take care of the staffing issue through attrition, because we know there will be some positions changing. So Ms. Hsu, do you want to share that information at this time?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So one of the things that we did is we looked at the budgeted positions from 2013, 2014, 15, and 16, just to look at where the staffing changes have occurred. So I thought it, just from a historical perspective, it might be helpful to go through and look at those. In 2015, we brought our public defender and a legal assistant in-house for our public defense. Those were expenses that previously were held through contract. We also brought our city attorney in-house. So these are things that are showing up as staff costs now, but it's not as if they were not costs before. They were costs that we were paying for, just in a different format. We've hired one firefighter EMT, one police officer, and half of that position is being paid for by the school district to allow us to have a school resource officer. We've brought in 2 water treatment plant operators, and that was really at the suggestion and recommendation of the Department of Health. They did not like the idea of having staff working at the water treatment plant, providing water to regional providers and to the city, with only one person working there at that facility. So now we have 2 staff on working during the evening shifts. We brought in a lab instrumentation technician at the water treatment plant, 1 wastewater treatment plant operator. We previously contracted for our Channel 10 services, and also the recording services for the council meetings, the planning commission meetings, the special meetings, and we brought that in-house as well, so that is a half-time position. We have 2 additional street maintenance positions as a result of some additional services that we're offering at the operations, and with things like the roll-on, roll-off.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we brought in an associate planner. So I think when we look back at those positions, you can see that there were specific things that we talked about, and those positions were filled to address needs that we had at the city.
Thank you, Ms. Shu. Is there members of the audience that would like to address the council on this item this evening? Yes, come up to the microphone. You give us your name and address for the record. Welcome.
Bill Perkins, S Avenue in Anacortes.
Thank you.
I would like to concur with Mr. Johnson that we don't seem to be doing enough and the projects are large. And I was looking on the budget website today and I printed out that in 2022, it's projected that we're going to spend $4 million on South Commercial Avenue complete streets in 1 year. It's out of the budget off the website. And this is all for 22. You're going to have $1 million for R Avenue long-term improvements, $900,000 for 12th and K Avenue intersection, $5.69 million for SR 20 spur sidewalk improvements. So in 1 year, you're projecting to spend almost $6 million for sidewalks, and we can't find money for streets. And how many people walk and how many people drive in town. It looks like a lot more people drive than walk. So I would concur with Mr. Johnson. It looks like there's some planning that really need to spend some money on the streets. And the 1.1 million that you have projected every year doesn't allow for inflation from 1 year to the next. So 1.1 million 10 years from now is actually less than 1.1 million this year. So your spending proportion is going down. I looked at this budget today and I just kind of like, are you guys real? It doesn't look real.
I believe, to answer your question, I think some of that money is state money. Am I correct on that, Mr. Buckemeyer?
It says impact fees. Does that mean anything? I don't know what that means. Sorry, I'm ignorant.
Mr. Hoagland, do you want to address that piece when Mr. Perkins sits down? Thank you.
Right. We listed the funding sources in the CFP. Those projects that he's referring to that have impact fees listed are being driven by growth requirements that are coming out of the comp plan. And that's why impact fees are being used to fund those projects. When new construction takes place, there's a fee.
But SR 20, is that a state project, Mr. Buckemeyer? Do you know, Mr. Hoagland? Yeah, so I'm wondering if some of it's pass-through money is what I'm thinking, because I concur with you. We don't, that's a lot.
Some of that was SR 20, but then you have a bunch of other things. We're spending almost 700,000 plus on the splash park. We can find money for a splash park in a cold climate. I mean, I'm not from here originally, but this is a cool marine climate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we can find money.
We got donations for that, and we got a grant, so it wasn't, we did other funding sources on that also.
And then I was looking at the report from on the roads, the condition of the roads. I forget what the name of that one is. And on page 4, they show the condition, the PCI range on the roads, and they have a total, and the total doesn't add up. I looked at this table, and there's a mathematical error.
Okay.
And if I'm the first one to read it, I'm kind of disappointed.
Okay.
Can I show somebody, so they
Yes,
can
will
see
you
where
show our finance director right there, and he can get that information back to us. So, Mr. Buckemeyer, on the SR 20, would that be a pass-through from the state, just so we understand?
I don't have that document in front of me, but if you'll remember when we did the comprehensive plan and we established our new transportation impact fees, there were a list of projects that went with that, and I believe that list of projects is what he's talking about. One of those, or some of those, are sidewalk projects, and by separating the pedestrian and bicycle traffic from the motor vehicle traffic, you actually increase or decrease the level of service for the street, for the vehicles itself. So that's why you'll see some pedestrian improvements in there, even though it's an aid to vehicle traffic.
Okay.
Just, Mayor,
Mr. Johnson.
and just as I understand impact fees, you determine where the problems are. And the only way you can use impact fees is to correct the problems that are identified. And so you can't randomly spend it on projects around town. You have to fix the problem you identified in the comp plan.
Very good, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Hoagland.
And just to clarify, we'll be talking about the CFP, Capital Facilities Plan, which that public hearing is still open, but we kind of jump back and forth between our biennial budget and the CFP in that discussion. So just to clarify the points we were talking about on the biennial budget, the one change that we are going to make is changing the revenue streams from the Transportation Benefit District in 2018, replacing that $300,000 in the draft with $300,000 in REIT. There will still be $300,000 for the first $20 fee, an additional $300,000 in REIT, but that second fee is being removed out of the draft budget. That's the only change that we've made. Another question that came out of last week was regarding the library carpet. We did take a look at that. I talked with our facilities manager, and his concern with that is where the carpet is starting to buckle is in some high traffic areas, and it is becoming a trip hazard. As much repair work has been done as probably can be done on that carpet, so it's really a matter of starting to replace at least sections of the carpet. So that's something that we are a little bit hesitant to pull out of the budget.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Lovelock.
So going back to that spreadsheet you had that was talking about REIT, am I clear that those were overages that would just typically go into the reserves? I mean, what happens to that extra $1.6 million?
Right.
I mean, for example, like one of my concerns was the senior center roof. Why pay for a roof again and again when we could buy the good one now and not have to buy it again when we have that much overage in REIT?
So those fund balances that we have in REIT, those actually got built up over 4 or 5 years. We really didn't do much in terms of capital when the recession was going on. We were still collecting a little bit of REIT, 300,000 a year in REIT, and we were just banking that. Now that things are taking off, we're really benefiting from that inactivity during those years. But it's, as I explained, that it makes budgeting really, it makes it nice to budget knowing that you've got that reserve there for the time frame when the real estate market does start to tail off. We budgeted, you know, 600,000-700,000. REIT drops down to 400,000 or 500,000. The following year, the same thing. We've got that reserve to fall back on to continue doing those projects.
Okay, other members of the audience who'd like to comment on the budget? Mr. Wara.
I'm Dan Wara. My residence is 2405 Washington Court, but I'm coming here representing the Port of Anacortes, located at 100 Commercial Avenue. And I just want to talk a little bit about a letter that I gave to the mayor earlier this evening, and I'll kind of read the letter here. From what the port's learned through council meetings and discussions with city staff and council members, the city is looking into various strategies to bridge the budget gap created by new stormwater compliance requirements. The port's sympathetic to these efforts and understands firsthand that achieving compliance can often have significant planning and budgetary impacts. It's only logical that the city look to commercial storm drain customers to help bridge the funding gap. On behalf of the port, our tenants, and our industrial neighbors, please accept these comments as a request that the city take a measured approach to increasing fees for business. The port's heard several proposals and has concerns with plans, including an early proposal that the fees would double within a period of months. Even for the port, a quick doubling would create a significant impact that the port would not have time to budget for. To illustrate, in the last calendar year, the port's paid $46,000 in commercial storm drain fees. A doubling would bring this to over $90,000. Additionally, the port currently processes our own stormwater at Pier 2 and has included rain gardens and other low-impact design elements into our recent construction efforts. The port asks that the city's revised approach to stormwater, that it considers credit for businesses that are making efforts to reduce the impact to the city's stormwater system. To be clear, the port is not asking that the city refrain from raising rates. The port understands the challenges that permit compliance creates and supports the city in their efforts. The port's request is that the city take a business-friendly approach and ask that any increase in fees be incremental and phased in over time so that businesses have appropriate time to budget and absorb the fees. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wara. And I'm happy to say that the Finance Department and Public Works has been addressing a business-friendly approach. There won't be doubling of business rates this next year. Mr. Hoagland?
So that's all I have on the budget. I'm happy to answer any other questions, provide any additional information council may want.
And is there any other member of the audience that would like to address the council on the budget? Mr. Clark.
Good evening. My name is Dennis Clark. Address is 3805 M Avenue. It was in July of 2014 when you committed to improving our streets with the Council Resolution 1895, and I'm glad to see you have followed through on that. We're now looking at the years 2 and 3 of that. So I'd ask you to stay the course on that. It's an important investment. If we don't do it now, when we do have revenues, then when are we going to do it? We got in a situation with a pavement condition index of 64 because of necessary decisions made during the Great Recession. Now's the time where we dig out of that. Please stay the course with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Anyone else like to comment on the budget? So I'm going to close the public hearing unless there's someone that would like to address us on the budget. And council will continue the discussion.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Archibald.
For our previous discussions, it sounded like the TBD or the TAB fund was the biggest concern for most of the council members, was raising that. I was wondering if there's any other major concerns that weren't answered by Mr. Hoagland so we can move forward with this budget. Is there any other major concerns from anybody?
Mr. Johnson.
I'd be interested in having Mr. Walters here to be part of the vote for the budget, if he plans to come back next week from wherever he's gone, but it'd be nice to have the entire council pass that, okay. I'm thinking.
All right. So we could move this forward to next week. Is that what you're asking? So we've closed the public hearing, we've had discussion, and next week we can look at possible action with Mr. Walters with us. Very good.
Mayor
Okay.
Garrett.
Miss Loveland.
I'm just going to put one last pitch for the roof. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, thank you, Mr. Hoagland, and we'll bring this back next week. So we're moving on at this time to item 6E, which is also a public hearing. This is a continued public hearing on ordinance 2994, adopting the 2017 to 2022 capital facilities plan, as Mr. Perkins addressed a few minutes ago. Mr. Hoagland.
Thank you, Mayor. I handed out a new updated copy of this table, the CFP table. It's got all of our capital facilities plan projects over the next 6 years, 2017 through 2022, by department. The bottom line didn't change. This is the matrix that you'll find on the ordinance. The bottom line didn't change, but we did shuffle a couple of projects between departments. We had Clyde Creek Water Quality Project that was in the planning department previously. We moved that to the storm drain fund. And we had a piling removal project in the planning department that we moved into general government. And we removed the planning department out of the department summary altogether. But just a matter of housekeeping. All of these projects that are identified in the 2017-2018 timeframe have been included in the biennial budget. And as we've talked about before, with primarily the use of REIT and grants and other funding, those are included in the biennial budget. We do have a balanced budget that includes this body of work.
Mayor Garrett.
Ms. Loveland.
I just think it's really important to reiterate to the public that the capital facilities plan tends to house a lot of big desires for the future of our city, but also are there to be placeholders for the possibility of federal and state grants. So like when I look at this and I see that we have almost 17 million going into the parks capital facilities plan, and you look at what the actual projects are, 15 million of that is earmarked for a possible grant that would be coming to replace the Tommy Thompson Causeway. So I just want to make sure that as citizens take a dive into the budget and into the capital facilities plan, that they're keeping that in mind, because these are not all going to be locally generated dollars. So that's just for the public's consideration.
I appreciate that.
So we do have the final document is not completed. I'm hoping to get that out in an email to council in the next week or two, but none of the information that's presented in the ordinance will change, and that's what's on the agenda tonight. But happy to address any questions, concerns that any councilman might have.
Mayor Gear, I have a question. I see that the Commercial Ave Pocket Park, is that the one we're talking about next to Penguin Coffee? I thought that we found the funding for that to happen, well, certainly prior to 2019. Maybe Mr. Meisberg can answer that one. Do you have a copy of the CFP there? Okay. Or do we have another commercial pocket park in mind?
I don't have another commercial pocket park in mind now. I think the intent was there is some funding left over from our budget this year. And then if I remember correctly, the Parks Board came to one of our city council meetings and dedicated some money to finishing that up. So we're hoping to get some of that allocated this year.
Okay, because we have a placeholder of $100,000 in 2019 in the CFP.
afraid I can't.
I'm sorry. After the departmental budget review that we had with parks, that was a concern that Ms. Pickett brought up, that pocket park had disappeared from our planning, our budget planning, and this is the feedback we got from the Parks Department. So the placement in here is based on that feedback from Parks, but we could certainly clarify that.
That they thought they couldn't achieve the project until 2019? This is the one time we didn't have a parks person here. Usually they have a rep.
I'm sorry, I can't speak any further about that.
Sure,
but
that's fine.
I'm happy to follow up on that.
Great. Yes, Mayor Gear.
Let's follow up on that. Mr.
Yeah,
Johnson.
there was an additional $30,000 by the Anacortes Parks Foundation towards this project, so I think that pretty well covered the cost, as I understand.
So we can get an answer for that before next week. Okay. Members of the audience, would anyone like to comment on the capital facilities plan? All right. I'm inclined to leave this open until next week since we have a few more questions to answer. Council, any more discussion? I will bring this back.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Johnson.
Will this massive spreadsheet be part of our electronic package next week?
Yes.
Great.
Happy to send that out.
All right.
Pardon?
So this.
Yeah, in fact, we'll add it to the packet tonight, so it'll be available immediately.
All right. Thank you. So we're going to move on now to item 7A. And I don't, is Officer Nybo here this evening? So we'll just keep the agenda in the correct order. All right. So item 7A is the proposed draft Title 19 land use permit procedures. This is an introduction and discussion item only this evening. Ms. Swetnam.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council, members of the audience. So tonight is the introduction to council of the proposed update. We're calling it Title 19, but it really goes a lot farther than just to update Title 19. This is where the bulk of the nuts and bolts of the land use procedures that we're looking at recreating into a new Title 19 will be accomplished. So just to give you a reminder and an overview of the timeline that's been established for accomplishing all of the code updates, you'll see there that the top 3 or 4 are scheduled to be adopted by the end of 2017. And those are code enforcement and penalties, which we've talked about at Title 20, land use permit procedures, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, stormwater clearing and grading, which is going to be coming back next week, I believe, and then medical marijuana cooperatives, which we've now accomplished. So we've gotten one of them done. The primary driver on this timeline right now, just to remind everybody, is that we are required through our NPDES Phase 2 permit to update our code by the end of calendar year 2016 to establish low impact development as the preferred mechanism in new development regulations. And so in order for those code sections and that update to be effective, we need to have the land use procedures and the code enforcement procedures in place to allow that to move forward. So the highlights of the ordinance before you, and this is really boiled down, there's a lot in there. But the big picture is that it creates a new Title 19, which is the Unified Development Code. This particular ordinance, it creates general provisions, definitions. It addresses legislative actions. It describes procedures, provides rules for non-conforming uses, and provides criteria for variances. It also attempts to remove procedural rules that are inconsistent from various other titles, including 3, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And the other issue, which I suspect we'll hear some feedback from the public on, is that it recommends a hearing examiner to hear certain categories of project applications. So since some of our earlier discussions, we've actually in working with Makers, who's the consultant that the city's hired to help with the development codes, which that effort started but will spill into 2017. They have worked with us to reorganize proposed Title 19 in a way that we see as more user-friendly and more intuitive based on kind of categorizing things into divisions. I was not sure about whether divisions made sense for us, but I've been convinced that they're a good way to give people guideposts throughout the code. So it's broken down into 8 general divisions. Division 1 is general and legislative provisions. These are general provisions that are applicable to the entire Title 19. Division 2 is kind of where a lot of the meat is going to be found, and that's procedures that will address things like application procedures, concurrency, public improvements, permit revision, and expiration. Division 3 deals with permits, things like land divisions, boundary line adjustments, conditional uses, and variances. Division 4 will address zoning and land uses. Divisions 5 and 6 are community design and project design, and that's where Makers will be putting the standards that they're going to be working on into 2017. Division 7 is going to deal with the environment, and that's where we'll see a lot of the stormwater updates that will be coming back before you next week. And then finally, Division 8 addresses development agreements, both generally and specifically the development agreement with the port. So to introduce council or reintroduce council, the next slide here is the decision matrix. And again, I always say this, but I apologize for the amount of content that's in this chart. But this really seems to be a user-friendly way to flag different types of projects and what the procedural benchmarks are for each of those categories. The other thing that is nice about this matrix is that as council hears feedback from the public and considers the types of projects and procedures that are being proposed in this ordinance, it's easy enough to change things from one category to another, or to change out if, for example, council ultimately decides not to adopt the Office of the Hearing Examiner. We could move those Type 3 hearing examiner decisions into the Type 3 Planning Commission category. So additionally, I just want to mention under types 1 and 2, you'll see that there is a local appeal to the hearing examiner. If we do not move forward with the hearing examiner system, those would be Board of Improvement or Improvement Board, Board of Adjustment, however we ultimately decide to deal with those. So just to kind of give you the big picture here, you can see that there are essentially 5 categories. Type 1 are administrative or ministerial actions that require really no discretion on the part of the decision maker. Type 3 are administrative decisions that do require some discretion on the part of the decision maker. Type 3 hearing examiner decisions are those decisions that we're recommending be dealt with by the hearing examiner, and those include things like special use permits for towers or antennas and level 3 variances. Type 3 Planning Commission decisions are decisions that require probably some more public input, and so those are conditional use permits, shoreline substantial development permits, shoreline conditional use and variance permits, etc. And then the final type of decision are city council decisions, and those would be essential public facilities, manufactured home subdivisions, long subdivisions, site-specific rezones, and shoreline substantial development permits for projects over $1 million. So for each of those categories, what we've done is we've identified the key pieces of the procedure to identify how that relates to each of the categories. So for example, pre-application conference are required for types 3 hearing examiner, type 3 planning commission, and type 4 city council. But for types 1 and 2, whether or not a pre-application conference needs to happen is going to depend on the project itself. If it's a really straightforward project, it may just add expense and burden to the applicant. Whereas it might make sense to have one if the director knows that there are going to be some concerns about the project. The matrix also looks at whether pre-application neighborhood meeting needs to happen, whether notice of the application needs to be provided, whether and what the comment period should be for these types of projects, whether there is a recommendation, and whether there is a pre-decision open record public hearing, who the decision maker is, whether notice of the decision is required, finally, whether and to whom local appeal happens, and what type of appeal hearing there is. So again, this is an introduction to the most recent updated version of Title 19. So we're welcoming feedback, and hopefully, as a group with council members and members of the audience and the public who lean in and think about how these procedures are going to play out, we can identify any things that need to be adjusted, and we'll look forward to working through that process. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
In this final column, type 4 city council decisions, did these decisions lie with any other body before this chart was made?
No, I believe these have always been city council decisions. And so what's happened in the past is that you got a recommendation from the planning commission, and then there was an opportunity to appeal that to city council, and then city council made the final decision.
Okay, thanks.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Lovelet.
So say we have a land use decision that has been appealed at the planning commission level. What does this do to alleviate the burden of city council hearing both the appeals and the underlying plat at the same meeting? Does this seek to address that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a little bit different. So I think the situation that you're talking about would be the type 4 council decisions, where in the past that's been the procedure that planning commission recommendations could be appealed. Now we are not providing we're not providing an appeal for planning commission recommendations. So planning commission makes a recommendation to city council. City council hears that recommendation and makes a decision. And then from there, the next step would be Land Use Petition Act in Skagit County Superior Court.
So where is the opportunity for the appeal to come in from the public?
So we have, let's see here, there is no local appeal on these types of projects. And again, we can change that. We just couldn't come up with a non-clumsy way to do that. Because if you have a planning commission making recommendations to city council, then you're in that awkward position of hearing the appeal and then having to make a decision on the project. Now, if council, I have understood that people were very concerned about these types of projects having an appeal occur before a hearing examiner, and there's been a lot of pushback about that, especially during the former discussion about a hearing examiner. But that's how most other jurisdictions handle local appeals of these types of projects, is that the appeal would not go before city council and then city council have to make a decision, but that the appeal would go to the hearing examiner. Here, we're not proposing that be set up under the hearing examiner system, so it would be a LUPA petition. But again, we can change that. I mean,
okay, so just to take it a step further, so if there was a hearing examiner in there that was hearing an appeal, can the public still appeal a hearing examiner decision to the council, or does that then go to court?
So the way that we've got it set up is that if the hearing examiner is making a decision on this middle category, type 3 hearing examiner decisions, if they're the decision maker for a special use permit or a level 3 variance, then their decision can be appealed to city council. If, however, the hearing examiner is sitting as the local appellate body, I believe we do not have a second appeal to city council, and I'm not sure that really conceptually makes sense, that you would have, somebody have to go through an appeal process before a hearing examiner and then go through another appeal process before city council. I'm not aware that that's been recommended.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Adams.
So under the planning committee decision, so that'd be type 3 PC, it says conditional use permits would be a decision of the planning commission. In this model, would it still go to the city council for final approval, or would it only go to the city council if there was an appeal?
Correct.
Okay, but if we're uncomfortable with that as a council, we can change that.
Absolutely.
Because it seems like we would, conditional use permits, based on my experience, and I would like to hear from other council members, but I would think final approval should go to the council level.
Yeah, and that's what's nice about this matrix is we could very easily pick up conditional use permits and move it from type 3 planning commission and put it into type 4 council decisions. So that's the kind of feedback I think that will be really helpful as we move forward is figuring out where we want all of these things to go.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Lovelet.
Then did we try to set up, I know that there's going to be a unified fee schedule for everything. Has there been additional internal discussion about setting rates for appeals? Because I know that was another issue that was very important to me, important to the public, was making sure that the appeal process is still open to everyday citizens and not something that's cost prohibitive in order to not further different land use conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point and a great question, and ultimately, so by way of background, Mr. Miesmer and Mr. Cricchio have been working on some research of what surrounding jurisdictions charge for different types of projects and for appeals, and have actually put together a proposed fee schedule that does recommend a fee for local appeals, not designed to be prohibitive really, but to offset some of the hard fixed costs that go along with these appeals, like publication, mailing, some of those types of things. So we've kind of talked about that as the guidepost rather than, like Mr. Walters has raised, the county charges $1,000 for a local appeal. That seems to many people to be excessive and prohibitive, but some kind of a fee to offset some of the fixed costs that the city pays seems reasonable and appropriate. But we will be bringing that back soon.
Mayor Gear. Ms. Pickett.
And I would also point out that in most cases, if there's one person who really wants to file an appeal, usually it's not hard to find a couple of others. So even an amount of a few $100s, I think, will not prevent justified appeal.
Perhaps.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Loveland.
And just to clarify, there's no charge associated with filing an appeal at this point.
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. Miller.
Well, I wasn't planning on saying anything, but still, to try to move this to the next step, feedback from council, recommendations on maybe moving some of this, or is this where staff would like to go as the way it's set up here?
No, staff is open to recommendations from council. As I said, if there are types of projects that council feels like they need to be the final decision maker on, please.
Okay,
please
and on the fee, there should be some amount of fee. I believe that there should be some fee in there.
Okay. So at this time, members of the audience, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Marilyn? Ms. Derrick?
My name is Marilyn Wells Derrick, and I reside at 1302 K Avenue. I have some comments to read and some questions, and I'm grateful to know that this is not a written in stone thing. What I'm responding to particularly relates to hearing examiner responsibilities. We as citizens have looked to our city staff to recommend projects that are meeting our city codes. As you well know, sometimes we may have an interpretation of the code that is opposed to a recommendation by staff to approve a project, and this may be related to our current codes, which are now under review. I know that staff and council are concerned about tightening up our codes, and I heartily support that action. Originally, we were told that if we decided to install a hearing examiner, that person would have limited duties. She or he would hear matters specifically on variances and special use permits for towers or cell antennas. Also, code enforcement was also mentioned as a role for the hearing examiner. I have always been, and still am concerned about, installing a hearing examiner, a position that would replace our citizen boards. And particularly, I'm concerned about this action taking place before we have our codes cleaned up. Referring to the most current matrix, I see that the hearing examiner would be hearing appeals on type 1 with no notice to citizens, and type 2 actions that are within the province of administrative ministerial actions and decisions, respectively. So will it be, if we have a hearing examiner, through that person in these two areas, that as a city, will that hearing examiner do our code enforcement? I guess I'm asking that question because the city is now recommending for an outright repeal of 16.04.105, which addresses enforcement, violations, and penalties. Also, 17.08 is recommended for repeal, taking the responsibility of administration and enforcement under that title away from the administrator. And the replacement, 19.02.070, says that no special duty is created, and goes on to say, quote, "It is the purpose of this title to provide for the health, welfare, and safety of the general public, and not to create or otherwise establish or designate any particular class or group of persons who will or should be especially protected or benefited by the terms of this title. No provision or term used in this title is intended to impose any duty whatsoever upon the city or any of its officers, agents, or employees for whom the implementation or enforcement of this title is discretionary and not mandatory." So it would seem that the city staff would not be responsible for enforcement. Is that what is proposed?
We'll take your questions and I'll have Ms. Swetnam.
Okay.
Okay.
In addition to this, the city is recommending changing the definition of standing and making it more difficult for citizens to have standing and therefore be able to appeal a decision. Please see 19.10.210 and check out the increased demands needed for said standing. Theoretically, then, the hearing examiner would be the one that enforces the codes by virtue of an appeal, even when there may be no notice to citizens, like in the Type 1 ministerial action, which includes boundary line adjustments. And in addition, there are more proposed limitations placed on citizens in the area of standing. Is this actually providing for the health, welfare, and safety of the general public? While this administration ran on the platform of transparency and openness, and I applaud the steps taken to do so thus far, I am concerned that these proposed changes actually will suppress citizen input and impact the same citizens who are paying for this whole process. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you, Ms. Derrick. Ms. Swetnam, can you answer that question?
Sure, and thank you to Ms. Derrick for a thoughtful review. I think she raised some good points. So some of those have actually already been addressed in the updated version of the code that's in the packet. So I think what Council's looking at is a more recent version than the one you were looking at. If you need help, I'm happy to email you an updated copy of it so you can look at that too. So one of the first questions she raised is whether the hearing examiner will be the one doing code enforcement. So first of all, the hearing examiner would be the one hearing code enforcement appeals. So it would still be city staff who would be enforcing the code, issuing citations, and as we talked about in Title 20, we've got we've proposed a series of escalating penalties to work with folks before it gets to the point where there's an appeal to the hearing examiner. So it is proposed by staff that the hearing examiner be the body that hears the code enforcement appeals. But again, that can be changed as well. One of the other points that she raised, so first of all, I'm not aware that we're repealing 1604-105, but I think the point that Ms. Derrick is raising is that she wants to make sure that the code reflects a duty of staff to uphold and administer the code. And I agree that that's very important, and we want to make sure that that's in this updated version in a way that council's comfortable with. So first of all, the updated version that we're looking at, we're talking about section 1910.070, and the language that Ms. Derrick read that said no provision or term used in this title is intended to impose any duty whatsoever upon the city or any of its officers, agents, or employees. Staff's already deleted that because I agree. I think that's probably a little bit confusing. So we took that out, and the remainder, that section is really intended to clarify that there's no specific individual in the community that is owed a specialized duty by the city. And that is an important municipal tort law concept that prevents the city from being subject to liability anytime somebody's damaged by a legislative action of council. So every time you make a decision, there's probably somebody who's unhappy with it and may view themselves as damaged in some way. And this language, you'll find it in probably every code in every city in the state that says that there is no specialized duty to the public. Now, if there becomes a specialized duty because of a contract agreement or some other duty that the city has, then of course the city would be responsible for its liabilities. But this is really a protection to ensure that that members of the public or that city council can take legislative action. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I will say that I believe in the new code, we did propose eliminating sections or chapter 1708, and I think if council, there's a couple of provisions in there that talk about and describe the duty of the administrator. And if council would like to see that language get put back in this updated Title 19, I think that's great. I think that's fine. We do have language, I believe it's at section 1910.030 in the updated version that says that it's the administrator's job to enforce the code, to carry out the code. So that language is there, but if, based on Ms. Derrick's comments, council feels like that needs to be a stronger statement, we can certainly bring those sections of chapter 1708 that express that duty over. I do want to address Ms. Derrick's concerns about standing. So the definition of standing, standing as it is now is addressed kind of vaguely in different parts of the code, and really the only guidance we have is that an aggrieved party can file an appeal in certain contexts. I think that's not really very clear for council. I don't think that's very clear for members of the public. And so the proposed definition of standing just clarifies that the people that have standing to bring an action and appeal before council are going to be city council, they're going to be the applicant, landowners, and the three-part test for people who are not those individuals is directly out of the Land Use Petition Act, which is the standard that most jurisdictions use for establishing standing. And those three prongs are an attempt to define what an aggrieved party really is. So to determine whether somebody is an aggrieved party, you ask whether they were prejudiced or likely to be prejudiced. You asked whether they have an interest that the jurisdiction was required to consider, which is a pretty broad standard and not difficult at all to meet. And then you ask whether judgment in their favor would eliminate that proposed prejudice. So again, I mean, we took a clear definition of standing directly from the state legislature, and I believe that's how many jurisdictions deal with standing. Again, we're open to suggestions. I couldn't come up with a better definition of standing than that. So hopefully that addresses Ms. Derrick's questions.
Okay. Are there any other members of the audience who'd like to address the council this evening as we continue this discussion? Mr. O'Hearn.
My name is Patrick O'Hearn. I live at 11039 Post Drive. I have a question, and I just want to clarify the process that's going to occur. It's my understanding this is just the introduction to the council of the Title 19.
Correct.
We will have a meeting with the Planning Commission on Wednesday, and as I understand it, there may well not be a quorum, so there'll probably be an additional meeting at a later date, perhaps next week. Then there will be then it'll come back to the City Council, and there will be a chance for the public to address the City Council again on this in greater detail.
Correct.
I know this is a moving target, and already there have been some very good changes that have been made, and I will be presenting some more written comments. I think that's a good way to do it, because that allows staff a chance to look at it, and I would like to commend staff. They've made some very good changes, I think. I did want to, I'm going to comment later about standing, but since it was brought up, I would like to bring that up at this point. Attorney Swetnam is very correct in the fact that the standing language that has been introduced is the LUPA language. The thing that bothers me about that is LUPA is a hearing in front of, as you know, an independent third party, and standing is determined by a totally independent third party, a superior court judge with no connection whatsoever to the decision makers whose decision was being appealed. If you use this standing, my question is, who then is going to determine whether or not an appellant has standing? Is it going to be you all as a city commission? Is it going to be whoever the hearing, the appellate body is? If that is the case, how are you going to assure an independent assessment of whether or not an individual has standing? And who's going to recommend to you as a hearing body whether or not a person has standing? Is it going to be the city attorney? Again, how do you determine an independent assessment of that standing? So I urge you to consider that when you look at standing. It has to be determined independently, because the appeal will be against actions of city staff who are hired by the mayor, who are supervised by the council. So the appearance for the public, and my understanding is that one of the things that this is supposed to do is create a more fair, more understandable process, and I think it will result in that. But please understand that the appearance to the public may be that if you restrict the standing and you also supervise the person whose actions have been questioned, there may be some concern about the independence of your decision. And I'll leave it with that for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Hearn. Other members of the audience?
Good evening. Corinne Salcedo, 4303 Kingsway. Well, I'm skeptical about the whole idea of a hearing examiner, chiefly because to me it seems less democratic to have one person making those decisions instead of citizen boards. And I realize it's not all decisions, but still, it's some of the decisions, and these questions about standing and about fees being instituted now for appeals. I just don't see that it's necessary at all to have a hearing examiner.
Thank you. Any other comments tonight from the audience? Okay, so as stated, this is a discussion that will be continued. Council, questions for Ms. Swetnam? Discussion, Ms. Pickett.
Mayor Gear, I just have a quick comment. There was an idea that if we do introduce a fee for appeal, that fee would be refunded, or we could set it up this way so that the fee might be refunded if the appellant prevailed. So that would be one way of organizing it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I think my recommendation would be that at least for code enforcement actions, where somebody's dealing with some kind of enforcement action against them, that it makes sense that if they appeal, they might get their appeal fee refunded. I think that logic is less so when we're dealing with land use projects. But again, as I think I mentioned this before, when I was at the Washington State Association of Municipal Attorneys conference, I went to a panel where there was a discussion about code enforcement, and there was definitely a consensus in the room that code enforcement appeals should be dealt with a little bit differently and maybe a little more financially sensitively than land use appeals. So.
Council, any more discussion this evening?
Just a general question.
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
A number of years ago, when we started this project with Ryan Larson's under his regime, we looked at a number of things that seemed to be contradictory between the various chapters, and we were going to deal with that at a later time, which is now. Is there any way to resurrect those various contradictions we noted at the time? Perhaps Marcia's notes are that good, but I think it would be good, I guess during the process, it's going to the Planning Commission, if I understand Mr. O'Haron correctly. It's going to the Planning Commission. They're going to look at some of those issues, and then it'll come back to us to look at those issues. Are we going to do that paragraph by paragraph like we did 3 years ago, or are we just going to kind of lump it together? I'm just kind of wondering about the process.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'll answer a couple of parts. I think Ms. Swetnam will have a lot of the rest of it. So we've been at the Planning Commission now on several occasions, and we'll be going back this Wednesday, and then hopefully following Wednesday as well next week. And what we're hoping for at the Planning Commission level is that this portion of Title 19, which is really just the procedures, that we'll be able to come back to the City Council with a recommendation from the Planning Commission. And then the City Council will have a public hearing as well and take comment, and then by the end of the year, get this adopted so that we'll have the procedural portions along with Title 20 and the stormwater regulations ready to go for 2017. A lot of the information that Mr. Larson brought forward several years ago, along with some of the work that was done with Ms. Drummond, it relates specifically more towards the zoning regulations themselves. And so as we're working through our development regulations processes with makers, we're going to be able to address those. And we already have hauled them out of the dredges of the closets and made sure that we've had a good look at them. But I think that's a bit of a synopsis, and please feel free to fill in anything I missed there.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. Council, any other discussion this evening?
Mayor Karen?
Ms. Loveland?
So my first blush on this is, one, it would be really helpful to have, and I'm sure it's in here somewhere, but can you direct me towards where we define what level 1 versus level 2, level 3 variances are? I'm sure there's a part, but we've got a lot of paperwork on this now. And then I kind of tend to agree with, if I understood Mr. Adams correctly, I think that conditional use permits should go before the city council, personally. And then, you know, if we're going to set fees, I think it should just be really low. I want to be able to recoup mailing costs. I understand there's administrative and staffing costs, but we don't want to have a barrier to citizen involvement that is financial.
We're not going to recover staff costs, so it seems reasonable to connect it to fixed costs that the city pays out of pocket.
Yeah, so it'd be maybe if we could figure out what that fixed cost is, and I know that there's got to be some streamlining possible because, for example, I know that some people end up getting 2 or 3 notifications for the same thing because in our register it's, you know, shows up as different name designations for the same address, so there might be some efficiencies that we can achieve in that department as well.
Mr. Archibald.
So I agree with Ms. Loveland and Mr. Adams. I think the idea of conditional use permits going to the city council for final approval makes sense.
Okay. All right. We will bring back your questions and we'll continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're on to item 7B, which is the DNR lease renewal discussion. Mr. Miesemer.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council and the audience. Over the past few years, city staff has been working with the Department of Natural Resources for an aquatic lease, which, if you take a look at the overhead, the dotted line represents that approximate area. And this lease, the city has been involved with this lease for many, many years. Cap Sandy Marine is one of the subtenants here, along with Fidalgo Marina. The original lease included approximately 83 acres and extended well beyond the jetty to the south. And at one point during the 80s, there was talk of a new marina that might be constructed in that area. Given some of the Department of Ecology cleanup activities and basic permitting requirements, it's been determined that that's really not a viable option. And so in our negotiations with the Department of Natural Resources, our thought was to reduce that lease area from 83 acres to 16.5 acres. And as a result, that reduced the yearly lease rate from $66,000 to $36,000. So that's a significant decrease in that lease rate itself. So there, with it, let me show you a survey of what that looks like. With it, there are also some easements for access. So this gives you a pretty good representation of access, and yes, somewhat difficult to read, but there are copies in your package. Essentially what the access areas are portions of what the existing W Avenue is, and then across the existing Capsane site to a northern portion of the DNR site where Banana Boats currently has a shorelines permit for an upland marina. So this survey, copy of the survey, shows the actual site area. This C2 comes up, C1 is here, this is Capsane, this is the Fidalgo Marine site here. So what we're looking at is that there will be some environmental responsibilities that the city will be taking on with this lease. That includes, over a period of years, the removal of the creosote piles, replacement of some of the wooden treated dock structures, to include 50% grading. There is also some soil areas that will require mediation, removal of contaminated soils. With it, we're looking at, for the easement areas, a one-time payment of, I think it's right around $48,000 for that, and that's good through the year 2034 when the lease expires. And so with this lease, we end up with a consistent Department of Natural Resources lease with our current leaseholders in the area. It also provides for them, I think, a very stable lease over the next 20 years or so. So with that, I know that's very brief, but if I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to. And we also have in attendance this evening Mr. Dennis Clark with the Department of Natural Resources, who I'd like to thank for all his help in getting to a point where we are today, bringing this lease to the City Council.
Ms. Lovelet?
Mr. Meismer, one of my concerns looking at this initially was trying to determine if we had an idea of the environmental cleanup costs, because sometimes those can be in the millions of dollars. And what were those numbers coming in at for rehabbing of the environmental areas and the planking?
Absolutely. Our responsibility for pile removal and some of the dock replacements, I've calculated out in today's dollars at around $130,000. The soil area, you will find in the packet that there was some soil sampling done not that long ago. It's very shallow, maybe 6 inches. I think according to our testing requirements, we would go down a maximum of 2 feet. It's very similar to what other owners in the area have done. I'm calculating somewhere around maybe 15 to 20 yards of material to excavate out and then move off site. Probably not that costly.
Mayor Gear, a follow-up question.
Ms. Lovelet?
So since we've been working so hard on our low-impact development techniques, do we have anything specific in place for things like boat washing or machine washing down in that area? Do they have to do it in a specific spot or in a specific type of soil?
It's a great question, Ms. Lovelet. Yes. That's kind of a two-part question. Boat washing. There is a facility that's located at the city boat ramp right around the corner that was constructed by North Harbor Diesel, if I remember correctly, and it has a complete boat washing facility, recapture and reclamation of the water. When they're washing the boats, it actually goes into our sanitary sewer. When they're not washing boats, the valves are shut off and the stormwater just drains off naturally. On the second part of that, if I might, when we're looking at low-impact development, Banana Boat Boats has kind of shifted a couple of gears on their thought process and are now looking at some bioswales and rain gardens for their site. But they won't be washing boats on their site. Cap Sandy Marine, I don't believe they're washing boats on their site either, but that does require a shipyard permit from Department of Ecology for stormwater purposes.
Mr. Archibald?
So I know there were some easements for the businesses to do business with there, but there also discussed some easements for the public as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And you'll have to excuse me, these drawings aren't the best. And perhaps.
Mr. Clark, thank you.
We have a little better one here. Thanks. Thank you, Dennis.
Very nice.
So, one of our early on drawings, 2014. So what this demonstrates is we have W Avenue, we have access across this portion of the Cap Sandy site. Along with all that, there is a trail, public access trail, that comes from the W Avenue, our existing travel lift pier, and follows the shoreline all the way around to the MJB property with a park at the end of it. And that's part of Banana Belt Boat's responsibility to construct that trail with their shoreline permit.
questions?
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Johnson.
See from the staff summary sheet on other opinions considered, it looks like all the neighbors and parties involved are very supportive of this effort.
Mr. Johnson, yes. At this point, I would say very much so.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Pickett.
I just have one question, and it's a total detail, but on Section 7 improvements, 7.2, the last sentence says the improvements are tenant owned. Now, if the city is the tenant, that's actually not correct. I mean, there are a lot of requirements about what shall be done with improvements, and I'm not really comfortable.
Well, I think...
I mean, we don't own the marina. That's a big improvement.
we would have a sublease with the marina.
Right,
so
but this is actually not factually correct, is it?
you want to answer that? Yes.
Thank you.
And Dennis did stick around throughout the entire evening. Might as well as have him talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
So I do understand the question, and it is a perceptive one. We construct these leases using a boilerplate template, and my choices are to either state that the improvements are tenant-owned or improvements owned by others, that is a party who is outside the contract. If it was important to the city, we could amend the language so that it read that the improvements are variously owned by tenant and owned by others, because that would capture the fact that some of the improvements are in fact owned by the city, whereas others are owned by parties who are not party to the contract.
I mean, I really don't know if it's that important. It's one of these contract things that's never important until all of a sudden it is, which is 15 years down the road. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Mr. Meismer's point that we have leases in place with the subtenants would cover any legal rights and responsibilities to the improvements that are there that the city doesn't own. Mr. Clark's kind of offered to amend the language to be more precise, though hopefully could be done fairly easily. So.
While the substance of the request is quite straightforward and understandable, it does require receiving approval from our Attorney General, which does slow the process, and I would recommend to the city to consider that.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Well, I mean, we really have two options. We either amend that, or when we sublease, we have to have that language in there for our subtenants, for lack of a better term.
Agreed, Mr. Miller. I think the best method of handling it is through our subleases.
And we can make a point of being careful to address any potential liabilities there.
Okay. So is there any other questions for Mr. Clark or Mr. Meismer? So this is our first look at this tonight, and we can bring this back.
Thank you.
And if you have questions or any concerns, let him know, and we'll address them at our next meeting. All right, thank you very much.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Johnson.
If there are no further questions that come up over time, could we just put this on the consent agenda since I didn't hear much tonight?
Sure. And is there anyone else from the audience that wants to talk about this? Because it was a public hearing. All right. It was not a public hearing. It was open to public comment. Excuse my language there. All right, so we're going to move on to 7C, Ordinance 2978, creating an AMC 6.04.035, reducing license fees for young and old dogs. This is a discussion and a possible action item. Ms. Swetnam.
Thank you, Mayor Gear, members of council, the remaining members of the audience. This is a question that came up from Animal Control Officer Nybo, who had people who were trying to do the right thing with their pets and come in and get their pets licensed. Right now, under our code, we're requiring that animals over the age of 16 weeks be licensed. But what Officer Nybo was running into is that people were coming in, puppy's 4 months old, they're getting a license, but the vet is telling them that it's not medically advisable to get the dog fixed at that young of an age. Similarly, people are coming in to get older dogs licensed. The dogs have never been spayed or neutered for whatever reason. But similarly, the vet's saying it's not a good idea to get those dogs spayed or neutered. And so it seems sort of punitive to those folks who are trying to come in and do the right thing to pay the intact dog fee of $50 for a year as opposed to the reduced fee of $10 for dogs that are fixed. And so this was something that Officer Nybo felt pretty strongly about, and she and Carrie Knapp in the finance department did some really thoughtful research into what appropriate age ranges would be. And so the ages that are in the code are directly from Officer Nybo and Ms. Knapp's research and their recommendations. So, and I did talk with the Public Safety Committee about this in the past, so hopefully some of you at least have this on your radar somewhat. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mayor Gear,
Ms. Loveland.
do we have a way of following up the next year? So the person with the young puppy, they come back to license the next year, they are just going to have had them spayed in the meantime. This is not going to be a continuance kind of deal.
Right, so I believe the way that this would work, and finance will kind of fine tune this, but when somebody comes in and has a young dog, they'll somehow demonstrate the dog's age and get the reduced fee, and then next year when they come back, the dog's no longer under 8 months old. Right. The dog's either been fixed or it hasn't been, and they no longer get to take advantage of the reduction based on age.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
I'm all for, encouraging people to do the right things with our fee structure. However, if I do the math, a 9-year-old dog is 63 in human years. I'm not sure, I'm no vet, but, there's still a chance. Just saying.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point, not me. We had that discussion about whether the ages were right. Are we opening, because the part of the goal that's in Title VI is to control animal populations and not have unwanted stray animals around. And so that was a point that Officer Nybo and I did discuss in some detail. Are we putting the city at risk of having an overpopulation problem with those animals who happen to eke by on either side? And she really felt that she wasn't overly concerned about that. But
I'm fine with the number. I just wanted to make that comment.
It's been a long night. It's good.
Comic relief tonight. Jay.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Loveland.
I move that we adopt ordinance 2978, creating AMC 6.04.035, reducing license fees for young and old dogs.
Second.
A motion by Ms. Loveland, a second by Mr. Adams to approve this ordinance. Is there any other discussion? Any comments from the audience? Ms. Hunt, would you call for a vote, please?
Mr. Archibald?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. Pickett?
Yes.
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Ms. Loveland?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.